in terms of demand now, I think briefly for context, if we can just set the scene with the context, the overwhelming overwhelming majority of current hydrogen demand is from existing industry and refining demands, which is virtually all met by fossil derived hydrogen from reforming, so it isn't low carbon. There isn't huge demand currently. There is huge demand currently for hydrogen, and it's being met with fossil-derived hydrogen that's feeding into existing industries that have been operating for a long time, decades really. I think it's just important to set that context so that when we talk about demand growth of low carbon hydrogen, that I'll go on to in a second, we know that the backdrop is that hydrogen's well established. There's a hydrogen industry out there. It's just not one currently of the low carbon variety. So moving on to low carbon hydrogen, currently it's very small production. It's less than 1% or something like less than 1% is currently low carbon, but demand is forecasted to increase very significantly. Forecasted increases are driven by new applications for hydrogen mostly. So that's includes things like steel manufacture, some transport applications, energy storage, power generation in some regions, synthetic fuels, those sorts of industries. Although it currently makes up a very small proportion of overall hydrogen demand, these demands in these new sectors it grew by 40% between 2022 and 2024. So they are growing very, very fast, even though they're currently a small proportion. There's evidence that policy and mandates are starting to have an impact. There's lots of contractual agreements being announced, MOUs. So that certainly demonstrates intentions, although it's not guaranteeing demand yet. And there are many forecasts out there that are all broadly predicting an increase from anywhere from 20% to up to 60% in total hydrogen demand by 2030. So, from that 20 to 60% range, you can hear there's a lot of uncertainty in forecasts, lots of unknowns, but all are still predicting a pretty strong growth, even at the 20% end. That's quite a strong growth. As I mentioned, future demand growth is driven by new technologies, and the future of each of these technologies is quite uncertain, and that's probably one of the key drivers as to why we get a massive variation between the forecasts. There's a lot of uncertainty in which of those applications is going to be successful and scale. If you switch on and off the different new applications within that forecast, then obviously the picture changes. And the challenge is knowing firstly which ones are on and which ones are off, and secondly how big is that demand associated with that new need. So that's kind of some description of the demand from industry and for low carbon hydrogen. I guess a point about low carbon hydrogen. So that derived from electrolysis, green hydrogen if you're into colours, or from methane reforming with carbon capture, blue hydrogen. That's low carbon hydrogen. It's anticipated that a little over half of the demand for low carbon hydrogen will be electrolytic hydrogen at around 2030. But of course, there's a cost difference between the two, and hydrogen from reforming is closely tied to natural gas prices, and so the forecast on the split is likely to change. But something like a little over half by 2030 is what's forecasted. So just recapping, the existing hydrogen industry, the current hydrogen industry, which is largely fossil fuel derived, is very big. And while low carbon hydrogen demand makes up a relatively small proportion of that, it is expected to grow very fast. But there's a lot of uncertainty. Bumps in the road for low carbon hydrogen demand could be the applications, which are deployed at large scale and which ones don't materialize. And as I say, more than half of the low carbon hydrogen demand is expected to come from electrolytic hydrogen, but that's exposed to a few things like natural gas prices and the success of deployment of reformers with carbon capture.